Hello and welcome to another episode of the Job Hunter podcast with your host Tim French. If you're new around here, we like to take a slightly different approach to the term job hunting. This show aims to find some of the UK's most interesting jobs and the people behind them, to stick our teeth into and dissect what their profession is all about. This week is no exception. I caught up with my guests over Zoom to discuss what it means to be human, why some tiny fish could unlock the secrets of our own biology, and why you shouldn't have any hesitation around the coronavirus vaccine. If you haven't already, grab your preferred beverage, sit back, relax, and let's get into the show. Hello and welcome back to the Job Hunter podcast. This week, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Sam Mackay. Sam Mackay is a postgraduate researcher at the University of Cambridge looking into evolutionary biology. Sam, why don't you start us off by giving us a bit more of a background on what exactly evolutionary biology is and what you're doing at Cambridge?
Second. So I'm Sam, and currently I'm in my first year doing postgraduate research. I just started this year, had the joy of a October 2020 start, a bit weird. I am an evolutionary biologist, and I kind of do what it says on the tin. I study evolution, but more specifically, the field I'm interested in is vertebrate evolution. I'm interested in how things with bones have changed over the last 300 sort of million years or so. Evolutionary biologists become in all kinds of flavors. It's a bit of a catch-all. Basically, the one thing that ties us all together is about 150 years ago, a chap called Charles Darwin wrote a pretty cool book, and we are all doing things to better understand the things that he thought he understood back then. That's
pretty crazy, though, that you pretty much all work that has come, since Charles Darwin is all based on his findings. You would have thought, we'd have got past that a bit, or we'd kind of reached the end of the book, wouldn't we, at some point? But we're still working on it, aren't we?
Yeah. So the thing with it really is, and this is a personal interest project of mine. I won't go on about it for too long. But when Charles Darwin originally published on the what's it called? On the origin of species. No, God, my brain has gone completely dead. On the origin. I think that's it. Whatever. When Charles Darwin originally published his book.
This is not a good start.
It's not a good start.
Expert in the corner.
On the origin. Yeah. Okay. Well, sorry.
I think it is the origin of species. I think
it's the origin of species. My brain is just going to us. It's been a long day. It's been a long blooming year. So when Darwin originally published on the origin, no one really picked up the book at the time. There were a few of his contemporaries who were based in London, a lot of them based around the Natural History Museum, who were fascinated by this, and they really pushed the publication of it forwards. But generally, scientists and normal people didn't become immediately aware of his work. They didn't necessarily pay attention to it. And you can actually see within scientific literature that for a good 50 years after he publishes this book, very few people are really talking about it. There was discussion between obviously the church and what evolution meant for that. But it's not until this guy called Mendel, who famously studied peas, and he's the father of genetics. It's not until his work was resurfaced in the early 1900s and people began to tie the idea of genetics and evolution, because in evolution you have a species which over time generates random changes in its makeup. And if those random changes are positive, then it survives. If they're negative, it doesn't. But what carried those changes, no one really knew about. And that was the biggest flaw with Darwin's work. And so in the early 1900s, because of the work of a lot of people, particularly this guy called Thomas Hunt Morgan, who studied flies, and that's why we all study flies now, begins to tie these two ideas together, genetics and evolution. And that's where evolution takes off. And so most genetics, which is obviously a really big field because we talk about cancer, even to be honest, talking about things like virology, very topical, can fit under this branch of evolutionary biology because of that work that happened. But yeah, we're still doing it because there's still a lot to know, because we're not quite sure exactly how everything fits together yet.
And I suppose the thing is, evolution isn't something that happens overnight, is it? Things just don't suddenly change. These things have been happening for hundreds, millions of years.
Exactly, which is a bit of a problem because genetics has been this wonderful tool to help us understand evolution, because you can look at something's genes and you can compare them, and based on how different they are, you can sort of stick things together and work out how things are related. But you can only really get genetic data from things which are still alive. But most things aren't alive. Most things are dead and most species are extinct. And so we have this problem of trying to fit together the tree of life when actually we can only really access a very little amount of data unless we use fossils, but then the fossil record isn't complete. So we do have this problem, and because the world's been around for so long, contrary to popular belief.
Controversial statement. But
oh, crikey. Evolution, and that's perhaps why we don't actually know perfectly how every living species right now fits together into the tree of life, because evolution's happened over such a long period of time, and you can't just hop in a time machine and take some samples from a woolly mammoth and then sequence its genome.
But I suppose what is crazy is you can tie in historical events, can't you, to evolution as well, in a certain sense. We had a guy a couple of weeks back who was a particle physicist. He worked at CERN, and he was very focused on what happened at the start, the Big Bang itself. But I suppose you can take these markers, can't you, through evolution and say, the dinosaurs died out because of this, and this, and you can pinpoint points in time, right?
So especially when we're looking at fossils. So the benefit of studying fossils is that, so lots of people interested in genetics and are saying you don't need to worry about fossils necessarily, because genes are so wonderful and we can just sequence the genome in less than a day. But the interesting thing with fossils are that obviously when something dies, its body lies on the floor, right? It sits on top of the soil. And then over time, those soil layers build up and it gets buried, particularly if it's died in a peat bog or a swamp and it's sort of sunk under. And so the order in which you find fossils from the top of the soil down to the bottom of the Earth's crust or whatever, represents the time point at which that animal died. And therefore you can tie in when that animal died and when it was around to these events that you were mentioning, because there are also signatures of these events deposited. So if there's a volcanic eruption, you're going to find lots of volcanic matter in that layer. And then you can differentiate between obviously when these species were around. And if there's suddenly just a big gap where everything disappears and you have all this volcanic matter or whatever, then you can go, well, maybe that volcano or that volcanic eruption caused a huge extinction event. So the fact that we know that there have been 5 major extinction events, we're currently going into the 6th. There have been 5 major extinction events.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. Crikey. A bit early in the podcast to get into that. It is because we can look at the composition of the Earth and all of those fossils. And then build up an evolutionary picture from that.
So that's kind of a brief history of evolution. What more specifically are you doing at the moment then? What's your research mainly looking at?
Nothing to do with fossils, nothing to do with a lot of evolution. So I'm what you would call, or I will be eventually when I graduate, I am an evolutionary developmental biologist. And what that means is I study evolution by studying the differences in how species develop. And specifically what we mean when we say develop is they go from being a single fertilized egg to being a fully formed adult individual who then eventually goes on to breed and die. So spoiler alert again. Bit of an existential episode here.
So everything dies. Wow, that's very heavy for a podcast.
It's only 6:57, but
exactly.
So what I specifically study is I'm looking at the formation of one of the most interesting parts of any vertebrate, their skull. So you look around and you can see that lots of different animals have differently shaped skulls. You've got goblin sharks and jaws. You've got goblin sharks, which have like these telescopic jaws, shoebills, which have these huge beaks coated in keratin. You can look at a whale, a human, a dog. We've all got really different skulls. But at what point during the development of these species from egg to basically being born, do their skulls become specific to the species they're going to be? And what point in time can you pinpoint, oh, this is when it looks like a dog, or this is when it looks like a whale or a human. And what I'm studying is exactly that problem. It's when during our development, are you delineated between, like, most embryos look the same, and there's an event which makes you go down the path of becoming the species you're going to be, in brief. And I study that using a mixture of things, but genetics as well as what we call geometric morphometrics. So geometric morphometrics, which is you basically get the skeleton of these animals and you stain the skeletons for the components of it, cartilage and bone. And then we can take images of it and measure like particular elements of the skull or the jaw and work out at what point they start to like become different from each other. Yeah, it's surprisingly simple. The only thing that makes it complicated is we're working with very, very little embryos that are incredibly microscopic.
So you literally take all sorts of animals and try and see their development through from being an egg to I guess being a slightly bigger egg, and then get some results. In an ideal world, yes, but science isn't ideal, and the issue with science is that so first of all, we don't have the genomes for every single animal, and therefore doing genetic work on all animals becomes a bit complicated. Instead, what we have are a number of species which we call model species. And these are species that we've already done a lot of work with. We already understand a lot about their development and their genes, and therefore they're ripe for the picking in order to study. And one of these species, so I mentioned flies earlier, those are probably the most famous, and they are used in genetic studies all over the shop, as well as mice and chicks. They're a really famous group of three. And then you have zebrafish. I study fish, but I don't study zebrafish. I study a cichlid from East Africa, from Lake Malawi, called Astatotilapia calyptra. And Astatotilapia calyptra wasn't a model. It is a mouthful. It wasn't a model species until very recently, and arguably it's still not. But the thing that's really interesting about cichlids is they've evolved over a really short period of time. So we were talking earlier about evolutionary timescales. It can be hundreds of thousands, millions of years. Well, these guys, over the course of about 80, I think it's actually about 15,000 years, we think, in one of these lakes, Lake Victoria, they've produced 800 species. So they are evolving incredibly quickly. And the element of them that's evolving the fastest, or the two elements that are evolving the fastest, are their pigmentation, the color of their scales, and their jaws and their skulls, the shape of their jaws and their skulls. And therefore this Astatotilapia calyptra, which has the form of one of those, the most basal cichlids, like the first ones that came into these lakes, is a wonderful system to study, because you can then look across at all the other different kinds of cichlids and go, well, they have different jaws and they're all of fairly similar sizes. You can keep them in an aquarium. In fact, they're really, really popular pets. And then we can study lots of these different fish in order to get a picture of the bigger picture of vertebrate facial and sort of skull evolution. So I'm probably going to throw out a bit of a controversial question, but how much of evolution is nature and how much of it is nurture? How much of it is down to your environment and how much of it is down to the way you were, raised, born, whatever, when it comes to these big questions? So
you've picked up actually on a really interesting question. It's a thing that I've been looking at recently, which actually you don't know about, which makes it doubly interesting. Basically, nature and nurture with regards to evolution, arguably all evolution is based on nature. Okay. It's we have, so you've got your genes, and over time they accrue mutations, and some of these mutations are good, some are bad. And we said when they're good, then sometimes it makes you more successful, and that gene spreads through the population. If it's bad, you die. And that's all in good. And that's our understanding of how genes work. Now, there are a few elements of nurture with regards to how genes are expressed and how they make you act or develop. And one of those is a thing called epigenetics. And what this is your body can increase or decrease the amount of time that a gene's expressed for. And therefore that produces like natural variability. And to some extent, we think these epigenetic markers may be inheritable. Now, the interesting other thing is that so with regards to nurture again, and particularly in cichlids, we find that in some cichlids, which normally only eat fish, okay, they're what we call pelagic predators. They swim around really fast and they use suction force in order to suck prey into their mouths and then eat them. If you feed these individuals algae, so there's lots of kinds of cichlids, they exist on a spectrum from hunting, predation, to sort of scraping algae off rocks. If you exclusively feed some of these pelagic predators, the fish-eating cichlids, algae, then they will form the jaw and the skull structure of the fish which eat algae. Now, we thought initially, that might be because of some mechanical thing, because you're making them scrape algae. No, if you feed them fish food made from algae, they will form these differently shaped faces. So it's not necessarily evolution, but it's pointing out that evolution and development and animal form are sometimes a lot more varied than we see on the surface. So we have this idea of evolution being totally directional, and it narrows things down and adapts you to be perfectly adapted to your situation. But in some circumstances, it produces this innate variability, which similarly, it makes you perform better, right? Because if suddenly there's no fish left, but there's loads of algae, and you can just have a differently shaped head because that's what you need without having to evolve it, then that's really, really beneficial. But evolution is 100% nature, but there are some weird little quirks in development which make it more adaptable and potentially based on your environment rather than like genetics and a lot of time.
So they're little fishy transformers, basically.
Yeah. But like far cooler, and like the films aren't.
Yeah.
Sorry, am I allowed to swear?
Oh, I'll have to bleep that. It's fine. We'll make it work. So a bit more on kind of what you do. How would you say, how are we so close to our ape relatives? What is it about us as a species that, makes us so close, but makes us so different at the same time?
So the biggest thing there is time. So humans, as we know them, us as a species, have only been like anatomically modern. So like our bodies have only looked modern for about 200,000 years, which in evolutionary time isn't that long. Now, prior to this, and actually like for the first bit of our existence on Earth as we are today, there were lots of other species of humans. So there was like Homo neanderthalis, the Neanderthals, or Homo heidelbergensis. Like there are loads and loads of these different species, some of which we interacted with so we originally evolved in Africa, around Ethiopia, and then we left Africa or migrated around Africa and outside of Africa. And we bumped into some of these friends, our cousins, mated with them in some cases like Neanderthals. And that's why there's some Neanderthal genetics in our genome. Now, if we go even further back to about 5 million years ago, we have a common ancestor with chimpanzees. Okay, so the thing which ties us to all of these apes is that we are apes. We all evolved from a long time ago, a single common ancestor, which, produced primates, and then it produced the great apes. So gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and us amongst a few other species. The thing is, because we share a common ancestor, we share the majority of our genetic information. And because of that, there are a lot of structural similarities between all of us. For example, I'm going to try. Yeah. But for example, we all have opposable thumbs, I think. Yes, we all have opposable thumbs. We all have generally hairy bodies, although humans have started to lose that. And the structure of our bones are very, very similar. Now, the differences between us and them, very briefly, and a lot of people like to think that we're enormously different from all animals because it makes them feel special. The only real difference is when you look at us is we're naked. We don't have colorful bums like some of our friends. And we are bipedal, and we have evolved to walk on two legs because that was beneficial when we were running around in the plains of the Serengeti or the Great Rift Valley. But otherwise, we're not that special. Our brains are a different size. They're a little bit bigger, but we are, at the end of the day, apes, as Darwin so controversially put forward 150 years ago.
Isn't it true, though, that, if you go and really, really far back in kind of our evolutionary chain that, you know, humans are distantly related to potatoes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's weird to think that everything is linked inexplicably if it's organic and it's you know, it's alive. It's linked, isn't it?
Because as far as we're aware, there's only one origin of life on Earth. About I'm not going to try and put a time on it, but during a geological period called the Archean, and you have these single-celled, well, animals is a loose way to put it. They're not animals. These single-celled things, organisms, just appear from almost nowhere, from the components that make up the cells: carbon, oxygen, phosphorus. And then over time, from that like single individual, it's produced all of the life on Earth, all of the bacteria, all of the plants, all of the fungi, all of us animals. It's boggling that that's happened. But because of that, we are tied really, really closely to all of these other animals. We all shared at some point in time like a single genetic code, which is mutated over time and evolved over time so that everything is perfectly adapted to do what it does. So potatoes are, well, as a plant, the evolution of the potato itself, like the tuber, is as a store for energy. So potatoes, as much as you might not think it when you look at them, like they have perfectly evolved to do what they need to do, which is store energy in the winter and then sprout up in the spring and reproduce with each other and make more tiny potato, or make more tiny potato plants, which make more potatoes.
Storing energy in the winter sounds very much like me. So maybe I'm 50% potato and I just didn't know it. But I didn't think I'd be talking about potatoes on the Job Hunter podcast, but there we go. Would you say you've always been interested in biology? You know, were you out cutting up frogs in the garden when you were a kid, or is it something you've kind of come to later in life?
It's two-pronged. So when I was a kid, I used to go out with my granddad. So my granddad wanted to be like an entomologist. He wanted to study insects, but when he was in school, he could only do 3 A levels or whatever. And he ended up doing history instead of biology. And so because of that, he was very keen on me like going and being in the garden or whatever and going to the park and finding things. And we'd go after school and collect lichen and like put them in a little book together. And that was like my first exposure to biology. I then lived in the countryside because it's cheaper than living in a city when I was little. And so I go for like little walks with my family. But biology wasn't something I wanted to do necessarily. I didn't really know what I wanted to do because I was a kid. And then I learned that doctors make a lot of money. And I thought, that sounds like a really great thing to do. But then I went to try and get some work experience at about 17 in a hospital. And I didn't even make it in the door. I met some people who were like the administrators, and they were awful. They were so horrible. I was like, well, I guess I'm not doing this. I'd almost to spite them, even though I was just spiting myself and putting myself in a position where I'm never going to earn any money. But at that point, I thought, well, what are the things I actually care about? Well, I was really interested in like in conservation, animal conservation at the time. And I thought, well, to be fair, there's potentially jobs at the end of the line, and I'd be happy studying that. I'd always been good at science in school, or rather, I'd always been good at biology. I've never been especially good at maths. And so that was sort of my route in. It was that I didn't want to become a doctor. And so I fell into this, but realized once I started doing it that actually this is really, really enjoyable. And I started liking conservation, but ended up moving into like evolution and genetics.
So I think you kind of raised quite an interesting point in a way that, you know, you don't necessarily have to follow like the set path that you think is laid out for you, and you can kind of just do what you find interesting. By the sounds of it, you've kind of done that. And exactly. I think that's as important as kind of being successful in your job, is to find the right job and being happy in that job.
I couldn't agree with that point more. I think there was a study that came out a little while ago that was saying about how it was like success, basically. And it's like, what makes people successful? Well, it turns out that being like a child prodigy doesn't correlate to success at that thing in later life. Because if you're naturally talented at something, you won't bother doing it. But if you enjoy something, you come across something and you enjoy it, then you tend to become more successful than those people who are naturally more gifted at it, because you like it and you do it. I don't think there's a prescribed path to do anything. I think there is so much power in just trying things. And obviously you have to commit to stuff because you need money, you need a job, but just trying things on the side and finding what it is you enjoy and just pursuing it, because eventually if you do it enough, you're going to get good at it. And hopefully, well, at least in this day and age, you can then monetize it, and that can be what you do. There is no prescribed route to doing something other than just liking it and doing it. I think that's so important.
Yeah, completely agree. If we could just quickly pull it back from the podcast, as I've done in my other episodes, still with a terrible name. I call this segment Tim's 3 Tips. I need to fix that. I still haven't done that yet, so I'm going to have to work on it. And this is a segment where I tend to ask our expert guests to give 3 bits of advice on a particular topic. And obviously you are an esteemed researcher. You're doing research at the moment on some of the big questions of the universe. So, what advice would you give to someone who wants to do a bit of research? Maybe they want to look into their family tree or want to do a bit of stuff on the side as a hobby. What 3 tips would you give them to doing good research, and where should they start when they do any research?
So the first thing we've already touched on is find something that you're interested in, like you care about, and that you're going to be willing to keep with what is it called, dogged attitude or something. You just keep on going in it because you want to know whether you want to do scientific research or you're just a little bit interested in finding out a bit more about where you've come from. Just finding the specific niche that you care about is the most important step. And the other tips really come from that. The second thing is broaden your knowledge on that topic. It might sound a bit daft, you funneled it down into a niche and now you're suddenly going wide. Because if you never stop reading about stuff, and there's a lot of value in reading, even if it's not necessarily relevant to what you're doing, but if you never stop reading, you'll keep finding areas of it that are interesting, and it'll keep you going. Yes. So if you keep on reading, you keep yourself interested in it, you'll keep on finding these sub areas of whatever you're doing that keep you interested, they keep you going, they keep you incentivized. And then the final thing, and this is a cheat for everything you do in life, just talk to people. I guarantee you, there is someone out there who has either already done what you're doing or is interested in helping you do what you're doing, especially with regards to wanting to go into academic research. You need to find and surround yourself with people who already care. Because 1, it's good to talk to people who are passionate. 2, it's useful to get some help. And 3, on that little topic, use the people around you who've already done it, because there's no point in you toiling away at something when someone else has already done it and they can teach you how to do it faster. So explore what it is you like, find the thing you like, then just go deep, go really, really hard, and just read everything you can find out about it. And then find some other people to have a chat with, because they are normally very, very valuable and useful.
That's very sound advice, I'd say. I think I hope
so.
I think that goes to most jobs anyway, not even just those little 3 tips, but I think we're very social beings, aren't we? Very social creatures. I'm sure you can tell us more about that, but working together and helping each other out is the best way to achieve any problems. So,
absolutely.
You don't just do biology. I think that's fair to say. Some of the other things that you've told me personally, but what kind of stuff do you do outside of your research work? I know you've mentioned to me that you do some work advocating for science, technology, engineering and maths for young people. So what kind of stuff have you been doing to that extent?
So a lot of the stuff I fill my very limited extra time with is, as you already said, I think advocacy is probably the wrong word to actually use, even though I use it myself. It's just basically science communication. So chatting about science and trying to change this image that science has, that it's something that's done by old white dudes who wear lab coats. And one of the biggest projects I've tried to challenge this with is a podcast I'm called Sit Down with a Scientist, where I do just that. I sit down with someone who you could call a scientist, who does science in some way. And the point there is demonstrating that, as I've said, not all scientists wear lab coats. Not everyone goes and works in a lab and does pipetting all day. A lot of scientists spend their time out at sea, using remote unmanned vehicles, sending them to the bottom of the ocean and filming whatever's down there, because we know less about the bottom of the ocean than we do about the moon. Okay. Which is crazy. Like this is our own planet. That's mad. Exactly. And so, and like science artists, and showing that like actually you can do science and be involved in science if you're just interested in something, and then just find where your skill set fits into that, whether it's doing illustration or like making pins and merchandise. Like, there's so many different topics within science, ignoring just science itself. So the point there was to show that basically no matter what you're interested in, you can do science and you can be a scientist. The other element is addressing that whole like old white guy stereotype. In fact, like if you Google scientists on Google Images, the top images that probably come up will be like Doc Brown from Back to the Future. Exactly. Or if you're lucky, you might end up with Jeff Goldblum from in Jurassic Park. You know, like if you're being really radical and you get a cool scientist, the likelihood is it'll be the former. But that's not to say that like scientists who aren't just white guys like don't exist, because they do, because I meet them when I'm walking around the university, or when I go to a conference, or when I'm doing like a science communication gig, but they just don't get the same airtime. So the point of the podcast, as much as showing that like, oh, there's science is really varied, it's showing that the people in science are varied and that normal people exist. People who are from your hometown or had your interests as a kid or look like you already exist in science. And I think that as soon as you can show people that there's already people like them doing it, it becomes so much less daunting to want to go into that field, because you're not alone. You're not the outsider. Now, that's not to say that science doesn't have a representation problem. Like at the end of the day, women are underrepresented in STEM. Ethnic minorities are underrepresented in STEM, because it is generally like an old boys club, but it's getting better. And biology, at least, I think actually the majority of people now are going in to study it, at least, are women, which is awesome. But yeah, really, so that's like my biggest thing. It's about just going like, normal people exist in science and they're really cool and you can get involved in it too. The other thing is trying to address the fact that science isn't talked about outside of communities where scientists are like the only people who exist. So on Twitter, you have these people with like 80,000, 100,000 followers. And it's like, that's amazing. Like they're advocating for STEM or like just like getting out into nature and doing cool conservation stuff. And you look at their followers and at least like a good half of them are just scientists. And it's like this little echo chamber, which is wonderful that at least you have an audience. And that then helps you get on TV and it helps you get into like the traditional media where you can talk about stuff, and not everyone is a scientist. They're probably all interested already, but not everyone's a scientist. But it produces a problem where it becomes really hard to engage with kids, at least, unless you go into schools. And so I'm really keen on trying to drag science into like other fields and other areas where scientists aren't the majority. And one of these, and it's very loose, but one of these is a podcast I'm starting at the minute, which is like an improvisational comedy podcast where we play Dungeons and Dragons. And the whole world is built around my personal knowledge of like the 18th, 19th and early 20th century landscape of science, the people who existed and the problems that those people have generated, problems we still are facing today. So like eugenics wasn't developed by some Nazi in a death camp. Eugenics was developed by this guy called, I think it's Ronald Fisher. And Ronald Fisher is the father of statistics. He invented huge amounts of statistics. He helped popularize Darwin's like hypothesis and theory. And like, therefore, when you think about it, like the whole of evolutionary biology is to some extent tainted by the fact that the founders were eugeneticists. That's why they cared about genetics, because they wanted to purify the population and make sure that the human population didn't decay. And I say that in inverted commas because, you know, first of all, eugenics doesn't work. And second of all, like the human population isn't decaying. Like we're thriving, we're screwing the earth, but like we're thriving, and we're in a position where we can care for people who historically we couldn't. Like healthcare is more accessible than ever, and we are inventing solutions to all of the world's problems. But we can't, you can't study evolutionary biology or I think most sciences generally, without at least acknowledging that your forebears, a lot of them were pretty nasty people. And that's even by their own time standards. So like, this isn't just that they had slaves and lots of people had slaves. It's that these people actively advocated for and invented policies which were designed to murder people and lots of people. And they, some of them played a hand in that. So the podcast is more fun than that, but the world is built around that in a way to sort of like, subtly educate people about this period of history and science. And the point is that most people who are a bit nerdy might be faintly interested in science, but they're probably not scientists. The majority of people who like watch Critical Role, which is a really, really big, famous Dungeons and Dragons podcast, aren't scientists. They're just a bunch of people who like video games or like fantasy books. And so I was like, that's like a captive audience. And you can just build an interesting world around these like scientific ideas and like slowly like put them in there without people noticing. And then I also occasionally do a little bit of like science comedy, but that less so. But yeah, so most of my stuff is about just showing that scientists are normal people and then about getting science out to normal people.
Yeah, I think
I talked for far too long. I apologize.
No, I was going to say like science can sometimes be seen as quite scary. Like I said, I was speaking to a great guy, Adam Rennie, about particle physics and everything that goes along with that. And I think a large degree is not getting too bogged down in the specifics, but trying to keep it interesting from the standpoint of why it's important to the person that's listening to it or watching it, because with the stuff you're doing, evolution is how we were made. This is who we are. Adam was talking about, this is where we come from. This is where we came from. This is what happened at the start of our universe. And it's trying to capture those images and those pictures. And, how do you engage young people with science at the moment? Everything is online. Everything is a social media age. How do you engage people in this new kind of world of TikToks and YouTube shorts and everything like that? What kind of methods can you use?
Yeah, so TikTok's been a really interesting one, and there are a few people who are like doing some really cool science on TikTok. Now the audiences aren't as large as like Charlie D'Amelio. Now I don't do much TikTok, but I know that's TikToker. But so your audiences are potentially smaller, but you can, if you do like a cool science trick, right? So there was this guy, he was called the King of Random. Unfortunately, he died last year in a horrendous accident, but he had a huge audience on YouTube by just doing like cool science experiments. Like, when you're a kid and you'd end up at a science fair or something, just by like, I don't know, your parents wanted you to do something that wasn't just watching TV all weekend. And like, they'd be like making ice cream using liquid nitrogen or like just doing huge explosions and stuff. And that's like the fun science. That's the accessible science that everyone likes. Now, when you get into the mathsy stuff, it becomes less enjoyable, but not all science is that. A lot of science is discover how this works. Like, cool. Well, you put liquid nitrogen in custard and you've got ice cream. Why? And a lot of science is just wanting to know the answer to questions. And YouTube is a good platform for that, because a lot of parents now who have an iPad, like an iPad is like a nanny, right? You can give it to your child and they can go on YouTube. And if you can like make your science fun and colorful, and YouTube is a great platform for that. TikTok, I think, is an interesting one because 60 seconds isn't very long. But it is long enough for a cool demonstration, and it is long enough to briefly explain that. And I think that there is definitely an open market there, at least for like the big bombastic science that you see at science fairs that like the King of Random or like Mark Rober. I
was just going to say Mark Rober. He is the man for YouTube science.
Exactly. And it's like, I think you can condense a lot of that stuff down in 6 seconds. Mark Rober maybe less so because his builds are so big and complicated, but you can at least show what it is. I think a lot of other social media isn't quite so great for it. I think Twitter is basically just occupied by scientists and like old people. Like, it's great for talking to other scientists, but pretty much where it ends, or talking about the news. Facebook is definitely a dying breed in that, like, I'm no longer on it. I don't think any of my peers are on it. And I don't know any people younger than me on it anymore. But I think that between TikTok and YouTube, you do have a wonderful opportunity to be producing content of two very different kinds that can at least engage people and get them questioning things around them and like going, oh, that's a really cool thing. Let's chat with someone about it. And if you can make them realize that that's science, that them being interested in it is them like questioning things and it's them wanting to do science, then I think you're on for a winner. Then you just need to not scare them off science in school by making them do statistics and lots of maths. But that's just a flaw with the education system, which we can get into another day.
As a whole different episode on another podcast, I'm sure, about how we implement getting STEM into schools and make it interesting. If I may, briefly, can we discuss the C word? Is that something we can discuss? Do you feel comfortable?
Depends which one it is. Go for it.
Obviously, there's a lot out there at the moment about coronavirus. Obviously, fortunately, we're in the position now to have a vaccine. So my question is kind of twofold: is, what would you say to people now in terms of the next couple months, from a virology standpoint, a viral standpoint? We're not out the woods, but should people be concerned about this vaccine?
So I want to preface this first of all. I am not a virologist, so I'm at its core an evolutionary biologist. I have done virology. I know a fair amount about how vaccines work, but just to preface it, that there may be some technical jargon that I'm not using or whatever else. The vaccine itself isn't something for people to necessarily worry about. There is a narrative being peddled by the media predominantly that and it's going to sound stupid when I first say it and before I explain it. Vaccines aren't about you as an individual. Vaccines are about your community. So with regards to dealing with viruses, you have two options. Okay, well, three options. The first one is you can hide away indoors and never come into contact with another human being. Now that's not possible, right? You cannot live in the society we inhabit now and do that because one, how are you going to eat? And two, you're going to become so incredibly depressed. We just saw that during the first lockdown, right? Like imagine if you do that and you actually never see anyone. So that's an option that's not feasible. The second option is you can develop what they call herd immunity. Now, what that means is everyone gets the virus and then hopefully they can't get it again. But with a virus that has a death rate as high as the current coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, a lot of people are going to die. So at that point, if you have to have 80% of your population get it, well, we're going to have a lot more dead people than 60,000 or whatever we have now. You're looking at hundreds of thousands of people. And not all of those are old. Not all of those are people who are already sick. They could be children with disabilities. They could be young adults with disabilities. And we can touch again on that whole genocide thing, but that's essentially what you're advocating. You're saying if you're weak, and once again, in inverted commas, because, just because you may have an underlying condition doesn't mean that you're not totally capable of being happy and doing whatever you want to do. Then you die. And so that's the second option. And anyone who wants to live in a society who genuinely cares about the people around them should not advocate for that. There are plenty of people who do. Generally, they tend to be quite selfish and believe that they won't be the one who dies or they won't be affected by it. The Lawrence Foxes of the world. Now, your third option is you vaccinate. And what vaccination does is it does the second thing. It gives you herd immunity, but no one dies. Okay. And I think when you look at those three options, that's obviously the best one, right? Like everyone can't get sick and they don't die. Like every year we vaccinate people for the flu. And that's why when everyone was going, oh, coronavirus hasn't killed more people than the flu. Well, no, rather, sorry, coronavirus hasn't killed more. Sorry, let me reword this because I accidentally just said something I didn't mean to. When people were saying initially, oh, coronavirus has, I'm not going to actually touch on that because it becomes contentious.
No, definitely.
Yes. So it's essentially you're providing a get out clause through a vaccine. And the thing is, vaccines do not pass regulatory approval unless they are safe at the most fundamental level. Now, some people don't believe vaccines are safe for a few reasons. Okay. Generally, there are two. The first one is that back in the 1990s, there was the Wakefield scandal, where a guy called Andrew Wakefield tried to publish a scientific paper which hadn't been properly peer reviewed, which had a tiny sample size and was based almost entirely on anecdotal evidence that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine caused autism. Now, it's very easy for anecdotal evidence to go, well, my child didn't seem to have autistic tendencies when they were 1, and then they had a vaccine at 1.5, and then by the time they were 4, they had autism. Well, babies don't present autistic symptoms. So, and it's very easy to tie things based on anecdotal evidence. And it's why in science, we tend not to do that. You have large sample sizes and you go, there's 1 million people. And if all of them have the MMR vaccine and then like 90% of them end up with autism, then yeah, there's an undeniable correlation there. But that didn't happen. So that's the first one. And the second reason people don't trust vaccines is that if you look at the ingredients it's lack of understanding. If you look at the ingredients on the back of a vaccine, you'll notice that in some of them there's a stabilizing agent, which I think it says mercury thiosulfate or something. And it's like, well, mercury, that's toxic. Okay, that made people go crazy. With a basic understanding of chemistry, you can understand that, well, mercury may be problematic when it's in compound form. That stops being so much of a problem. But then what that second point comes down to is poor communication. It's the fact that the press make an awful lot of money from people clicking on their articles. And therefore, when they start writing about the issues with vaccinations and the fact that this got regulatory approval really, really quickly, that then makes people concerned. And when they only read headlines on Facebook, that propagates this myth. So back to the question, should people get vaccinated? Essentially, yes. But you're going to have to wait your turn because we can only produce so many vaccines so quickly. And obviously the government and governments all around the world are prioritizing people who are more likely to die of the illness. This isn't going away anytime soon. We're probably looking at, I reckon personally, spring. We may even have another lockdown before that point, especially if Christmas is a little bit crazy and people muck about a New Year. But like there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And that does come through vaccination. And there will be lots of people who don't get vaccinated. I think about between 5 and 6 million people in the UK are members of anti-vaccination groups on Facebook. That's like 10% of the population. That's a lot of people. Now, fortunately, that's not enough people to completely ruin the vaccination effort. But I think if scientists and journalists actually bothered to take the time to sit down with these people and not just say they're idiots and not just criticize them and tell them what they're doing is so awful, listen to them, understand where their concerns come from and bother actually dealing with that issue, we could resolve this whole anti-vax movement, generally speaking. So yeah, it's the C word isn't going away, but it will be in a short time, hopefully.
Honestly, Sam, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. It's been super interesting to hear from you.
It's been a pleasure to chat. I apologize if I spoke too much.
No, definitely not. I think it's rare that we get to speak to someone so knowledgeable on so many things. So but before we do go, where can people find out more about your podcast, find out more about you if they want to? Obviously, I'll drop all the links in the show notes for anyone that does want to find out about that. But if the man himself wants to give us the deets, that'd be great.
So whenever I get angry and ranty, you can find me on Twitter at @SJ_Mackay, and that's MCKAY. Otherwise, the podcast itself is called Sit Down with a Scientist. You can find that by just searching on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you good podcasts live, and you can add a not so good one to the pile. The other podcast is coming out in the new year, so probably actually when you're releasing this, and that is called Live, Laugh, Lovecraft, which I'm personally very proud of. And otherwise Instagram is at Uncharted Science, but I'm far less active there than I used to be. But occasionally I make little fun videos about science. So yeah, generally Twitter or Sit Down with a Scientist are the places to find me, keep up to what I do. And I always love hearing about what people think. So you can always send me a DM on Twitter. I keep them open. It means I get a lot of like Chinese bots asking me to advertise their like weird merchandise, but it's worth it.
Amazing. Sam, once again, thanks so much for coming on. Stay safe. I hope you have a lovely Christmas. And yeah, I'm sure we'll touch base again in the new year. You too, pal. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me. A massive thank you to Sam for coming on the show. As you've just discovered, Sam is a super interesting guy, and you can hear more from him on his own podcast, Sit Down with a Scientist, or by following him on Twitter. It's SJ_Mackay. If you've enjoyed this week's edition, why not share it with your friends? That button has the power to expand the minds of young and old. And if that's not your cup of tea, why not simply press that subscribe button and leave an honest review on your platform of choice? You can also find us on social media. It's at JobHunterPod on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. Or simply search for the Job Hunter Podcast on YouTube. Prefer email? It's jobhunterpodcast@gmail.com. As always, thank you very much for listening to the Job Hunter Podcast. I've been your host, Tim French, and I'll see you next time for more interesting jobs from around the UK.